Hello, Chris here. And today's episode, I'm going to talk about the history of lasers. As someone who's really into lasers, for doing laser engraving and laser cutting and things like that, I wanted to talk about about lasers in general. I'm not an expert at all, technical or anything with when you're talking about lasers, so I'm just going to bring up some websites that talk about kind of what lasers are and things like that and the history of the lasers as well. So we'll look at that through the browser in a second. And just to let you know that the laser concept, I'll talk about it at some point too. And when I talk about the history, it came from Albert Einstein, one of his theories. So he did not invent the laser itself, or come up with the name or anything, but he came up with basically the theory that was later used for that. So, without further ado, let's look at the first website, which kind of just defines the laser, and we'll go from there from this website, and we'll look at just the history. But let's start with the definitions and some of the stuff there. So, as you can see, laser stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. So, and it's a radiation is not dangerous, but we'll talk about that too. So what they talk about here, and this is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of U.S., that regulates lasers here in the U.S., since it's used a lot in medical field and some other fields as well. We'll talk about, the basic laser, which is kind of the sealed tube with mirrors and, some sort of laser medium that's excited by a form of energy to produce visible light, or invisible ultraviolet or infrared radiation. So somewhat that's talking about, and they're talking about different gases. The most common one that we really see is CO2 to begin with, and the talk about different crystals and stuff, and we'll then also talk about diode as well. So this really talks about the basics and then kind of what lasers are used for, and they're in a lot of products, not just medical type products, and not just for engraving, but CD players, DVD players, scanners, different things, laser pointers, laser guided tools or things like that. But as we know, also Blu-ray player uses a blue laser, right? Now, they talk about the hazards of lasers, so light, basically, because that can damage your eye. That's the biggest danger that they see. I don't think they talk about burning your skin or something, but, they're talking about looking at a laser without it having any kind of enclosure and things like that, or even having it in your eye from a pointer or something. And then they talk about the radiation too. So this radiation, which is what the light is, it's radiation, but it's not in any way hazardous to humans. This type of actual radiation that comes from lasers. So, there's no danger of being near a laser for getting radiation or anything like that. And then the FDA also talks about what different classes and things like that. Most lasers are for engraving as a class 1, but they have all these different classes and types of things that they talk about. Class 4, like me, I got LASIK to see far away, so that's a class 4 laser. They talk about laser pointers a lot because laser pointers are something that's easy for people to get and can cause issues. If the beam gets in people's eyes, even aircrafts, things like that. So they really stress about that as well. And they talk about how they regulate the lasers in general. So from there, I wanted to talk about kind of the history, like I said, of lasers. So if we look at this timeline, we'll see like I said, Albert Einstein, he came up with the phenomenon, if I could talk, just a second, drink some water, the phenomenon of stimulated emissions, which is the fundamentals of lasers or masers. This is another thing that's similar. And then there you have Valentin Frab, and I'll probably get a lot of these names wrong. Frabkant theorized, the use of stimulating emission to amplify radiation. But you don't see, you see even in the 1950s, there really is a couple of different, three guys that actually developed the quantum theory of it and demonstrated stimulated emissions of microwaves. They got a new Nobel Prize in Physics on this work. But it was in 1959, and you can see Gordon Gould is the one who actually came up with the name laser, which is light amplification by stimulated emissions of radiation, which we read before. But he just came up with kind of that idea and the name, but there wasn't a laser at that point. It was here, you see, 1960. Theodore Maiman at Hughes Research Lab. So Hughes was a big company. Howard Hughes had done airplanes and things, and he had a lot of different companies. And one of the companies here was a research lab, and they were able to use synthetic ruby to create a actual laser. So they used ruby laser back for mostly, it looks like military and some other things. And then CO2 lasers that are very popular as a deal came in 1963 because they were cheaper than the ruby laser. Now I'll talk about diode lasers in a second, because that's another thing that happened as well in the history of the diode lasers and semiconductors and things like that, because that was another type of laser that is now very common and cheap. So we can move there, I guess. So laser diodes. So a diode laser basically uses semiconductors. Getting into, the semiconductors, I'm not very versed in that, but I mean, basically before semiconductors, there were vacuum tubes. I don't know if anyone remembers, having to go get vacuum tubes for their TV. These were not the best electronics and stuff, and they were big and cumbersome, and they had to have lots of space for cooling, to keep them cool and stuff like that. So when the semiconductors were invented in solid state, using silicon, these things, I don't know all the technical things, but that came about, was able to make smaller parts and things like that, and not have the need for as much cooling as you would with vacuum tubes and things like that. And when you have companies like Fairchild, and there's some other company before Fairchild Semiconductor, and then in the Silicon Valley, and you later had Intel that came out about from that. There's Gordon Moore came from Fairchild to start Intel with, I can't think of the other guy's name, but Moore's the most famous one. Of course, he had the Moore's Law too, which I think this talks about as well, where technology with the semiconductors gets smaller and more powerful as years go by. They find ways to do that, and that's why you have the lasers, using a semiconductor and diode to create this, light emitting diodes to have not so great efficiency in the past, but as things got further and further in this technology, the power and everything went better. And you can see that I believe it's General Electric was the ones who in the 60s had had done a diode laser, but it wasn't very powerful. But like I said, as things got more powerful and you put more diodes together, then you start to get lasers that are more powerful using semiconductors, and they were able to also use that to create fiber lasers as well. So using fiber optics in that, and to do the fiber lasers, that's where the fiber lasers came about. And you can read it here. Fiber lasers offer a cost-effective way to convert the brilliance of high-power semiconductor lasers. And then they can do all sorts of things to take all this and to do really good stuff. And you talk about fiber lasers and diode lasers have really improved and gotten stronger and able to cut more and things, so if we go, I don't know how much in 2000, lasers, and this is really, you talk about these things, they used them mostly in networking with communications and optics. I mean, that was a lot of it. You see JDS Uniphase, that's JDSU. Behind these other guys, I don't know if JDSU is still around, but could be. But lasers, became more for, industrial and manufacturing in the 2000s and so, and you can see how powerful we have lasers, diode lasers that are 70 watts, maybe more. I'm a 20 watt myself. And the cost is, pretty reasonable compared to, what it might have been. So that's really looking quickly at these histories here. And yeah, I'll have a link, all these links, so if you want to read more. So I'll put those links in the description, and if you want to read more on the history of lasers. But basically, it's pretty interesting that lasers came about from Einstein, and all these others developed it, and the semiconductor was later used to really, make it, I think, more efficient or more cheaper and things. Because if you think about the semiconductor, if it's a little module that you have on your gantry or whatever, versus having a CO2 tube or they have RF CO2 tube, so they use cooling that's fans and heat sinks versus using a tube, tube and water, and also water cooling, which is most CO2s have water cooling, but they have the ones that don't need water, so that's cool. So the technology is just constantly changing. You have infrared getting more powerful, fiber, MOPA, all these different things where they're using ways to generate a light. I mean, basically lasers is light, and they generate a light that's powerful enough to engrave things and to cut things and do things like that. So it's really a unique thing that came about in the modern days, right? It's a technology that's really cool. And I hope you learned some stuff here, and check out some of my other videos, and hopefully I'll have some more stuff just on lasers. I'm going to work on some video possibly of just looking at the different types of lasers and what they can do and what they're good for. A diode versus CO2 versus a fiber laser. They'll have all pros and cons depending on what you're trying to work on, what kind of material. So those are really good to know which ones, and to kind of look at what you may want to use or buy or whatever. So look for that. So thanks again for watching, and thanks. Goodbye.